September annually, the United Nations General Assembly holds its general debate, during which heads of governments address the Assembly. The 75th session of the general debate holds from 22nd to 29th of September 2020, and Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari is scheduled to speak on the 22nd of September. So, ahead of this annual historic convocation, what possible areas and surprises are we expecting? Just recently, the United Nations Global Alliance on Poverty Eradication was launched. COVID-19 and its global governance, challenge, the World Trade Organization, climate change, recharging of the Lake Chad Basin, interventions by the United Nations in the northeast region of Nigeria, and also on global competitiveness. Those will be our concern on the program today. My guest is Dr. Mukhtar Imam. Dr. Mukhtar Imam is a consultant in development areas and also an expert on diplomacy and international relations. The program continues shortly. Stay with us. By looking at a generic perspective, now documents are already flying preparatory for the 75th United Nations General Assembly, which coincides with the 75th anniversary, if I'm correct, right? Yes. Now, what should we be expecting?
Oh, thank you very much. The United Nations has come a long way. There have been areas of, to do a SWOT analysis, there have been areas of strength, areas of weaknesses, areas that are left, opportunities left untapped. And then, of course, there are several threats that the United Nations still faces, you know. So, again, an appraisal will be very important at this point in the life of the United Nations to be able to say what are the things that we have done right, what are those areas that are still wanting, you know. The SDG, for example, is a very good parameter. It's a good ruler to use in terms of measurement at this point in time to be able to say how exactly have we fared as far as galvanizing the entire globe is concerned, leadership-wise, development-wise, peace and security-wise, and so on and so forth. There are emerging, contending new issues that requires a lot of attention. Climate change is one of the huge, biggest areas that today the entire globe tends to face collectively as a challenge. COVID-19 did not give a warning, it just came knocking, and here we are.
We'll go into specifics.
Yeah.
And let's begin with the specifics. I know recently the Global Alliance for Poverty Eradication was launched by the United Nations.
Yes.
And understanding it means it's an alliance.
Of course.
Which means nations need to either recruit themselves in or take part in it.
Precisely.
But the question that was that was raised in most of the forums I attended has been, would they allow all nations to be at par? Now, let's look at the Global Alliance on Poverty Eradication. How do you think they should be looking at it from that perspective?
See, we can just oppose the issue of the United Nations as a body itself and the concerns that have been raised, like the one you mentioned in the forums you have attended, to the case of the Alliance on Poverty Eradication. The concern about the United Nations as a body itself has always been about distribution of power, either at equilibrium or disequilibrium. And by this, we had a certain session sometime, I think, in 2014, if my memory serves me right. In attendance was Professor Ibrahim Gambari, the current Chief of Staff to the President. A couple of other persons were in attendance. And the major issues that were raised was about how to create a balance at the United Nations, right? So I'm trying to bring that to just oppose the conversation now. Three concerns were raised. I articulated three positions. And first of all, it was about creating a balance where we can have equitable distribution of resources within the international system, resources distributed equitably. Second scenario would be to have the removal of privileges among small or big countries in whatever context and however you define small and big countries. Thus, the privileges that exist should be removed, and so that we can have a balanced system. Of course, some might talk about this as a mirage, something that cannot be attained, considering the nature and spirit of international politics. And then again, the third scenario would be about access to resources What countries should have nuclear powers? What countries shouldn't? Why should a country be in the United Nations Security Council while another cannot be, where you have virtually almost the same yardstick or parameter? Say, for example, if population is a factor, if China is the largest economy in terms of population in Asia, Nigeria is the largest population in Africa. So what stops us from attaining that posture? So these were some of the concerns that were raised. The same might play out in the case of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. When the United Nations General Assembly President, our very own Professor Tijani, my personal boss, was talking about the issues of when he was making the address about the need for that alliance. Well, of course, from what we know, 36 countries, it's a membership of about 36 countries as we speak. And the concern about with all of these countries coming together is about the very cardinal, the most important element of the SDG, which is poverty, that doesn't have a voice behind pushing it. You hear about a lot of people talk about the case of climate change, for example. People talk about the need for education, shelter, and so on and so forth. But that very important element, which is more or less a lifeline of the conversation, is not being given support. Now, the question would be, how exactly do you recruit countries to become members of this very august body? Because you look at the rank, the rates, the statistics, for example, it is tackling poverty. 70 to 100 million persons are being pointed to fall back, into the absolute poverty bracket, which is a very, very scary scenario. And then you look at the existing status quo. You have about close to 1 billion persons in the poverty bracket. Poverty, in this case, whether absolute poverty, whether relative poverty, urban or rural poverty, it doesn't matter. But they are within that poverty bracket. And in that figure, we're looking at about 700 and something million as being drained into poverty of unemployment, poverty of lack of education, and so on and so forth. So there's the need for us to galvanize powerful countries. In this context, powerful meaning wealthy nations to come on board. But then again, to your question, how do we guarantee that every country is going to have a level playing field within this conversation? Because, of course, the reason why the conversation, first and foremost, to recall, is being held is because there's poverty existing in some climes. And some climes are more hit than others in terms of relative poverty in this context, right? So how exactly do we get all the countries to come together to have a conversation around how to eradicate poverty?
So how would the debate go? Because I remember when the Alliance for Global Poverty Eradication was launched, Nigeria's president threw a challenge that by the last count, I think that was 2016, if I get it right, the poverty indices was about 400 million there, but I can't remember now. But now said it has jacked up so much.
Yes.
So looking at it, poverty eradication, job creation in a world of ideas.
Yes.
What direction should the debates at the 75th General Assembly be taken?
Well, if this is going to be part of the conversation, which I very much believe it will be, although other issues around COVID-19, global economic GDP, and so on and so forth might be thrown up. But when you're talking about global economic GDP and the recession that the entire globe is faced with today, which is inevitable, there is need to also have the conversation about poverty eradication as well. So I feel they're going to try to create a nexus between this alliance that has just been talked about and, of course, the conversation that's going to be held. Because, of course, the theme of the United Nations Assembly is around something, a shared future or something. Sure. All right, so now given that is the case, global goals, so given that is the case, it's very imperative that this sort of conversations are had, right? But again, of course, for me, my inputs, if I were to perhaps set an agenda for the conversation, would be to say, let's look at areas of education where we can have some kind of functional literacy debate on how to incorporate people into the education bracket. Mind you, there's a distinction between education and being lettered. We have a lot of reading and writing illiterates. We need to create that distinction and understand it clearly. There's often at times that misconception. So what we should be focused on now is functional literacy. How do we get more people out of the bracket of ignorance into the fold of productivity, which is what education is about. Education is about understanding your environment, transforming that awareness which you have gained into something productive that betters your society, that impacts your life and the life of other people around you. So the conversation should be around how to get more people into this bracket. Look, this is very, I just break this down as easy as possible. We are in a country where 65% of our population are still in the informal sector. We're talking about blue-collar jobs. Yet, we are still churning out graduates year in, year out, without the hub to accommodate them. The question would be, what exactly is lacking? We need to create a bridge, a synergy between those people who are graduating from institutions of learning and productivity. That is how you can get an economy to grow. That is how you begin to multiply. You have a multiplier effect on the GDP, and that is how poverty is eradicated. It's not about handouts. We've gone past the level of handouts. That's why I don't want to be drawn into the conversation of, say, I did not want to start this conversation by saying big nations should come into the alliance and help smaller nations or poorer nations. No, we should begin to look beyond that. How do we galvanize ourselves? For crying out loud, China is also one of the new states, you know, and it has been able to transform. It's one success story that the world can look to and say, let's pick certain aspects of what they have done and replicate in our own countries. So I think the conversation should be around, how do we aid these individuals to become enlightened, to become aware, to become conscious? How do we strengthen small and medium businesses? How do we bring in factories? How do we strengthen our technical schools around economies where poverty is at the highest level so that we can bridge the gap? How do we empower women? And what are the things that we need to do to be able to create the enabling environment for people
let's
to
leave
thrive?
it at that. Let's move on. Now, from the ambit of climate change, Nigeria's president has always sustained a position at the United Nations, which is the need for some succor, some assistance to come towards recharging the Lake Chad Basin.
Yeah.
And if that is done, the problem of migration, the problem of insurgency somehow be checked. Now, what agenda can we set for him? Because it's slated to address the United Nations on the 22nd of September this year.
Yes.
From that premise, what agenda should we be setting towards? He has talked so much about recharging the Lake Chad Basin, recharging the Lake Chad Basin.
You see, the truth is, how do I put this to sound subtle? International politics is devoid of ethics. It's devoid. International politics is not fair, and nobody gives, right?
But yet they give.
Well, not without taking something in return. This is what international politics has always been predicated upon, and that's why you find that treaties have never been signed fairly. It has always been about what interest I have to protect. Now, having said that, let's look at it with a humane face and say they give. But should we constantly talk about how they should assist us? Now, this is what I'm trying to do, to say, let's disabuse the mind of the president, if he's listening, from the idea of going to the United Nations. Of course, he has never done that in the past. We've never seen him go cap in hand begging. It has always been about, let's save humanity collectively. We can do this. Now, my position in all of this is, we must understand that issues such like the case of COVID-19, for example, should be an eye-opener. Multilateralism broke down. You and I were here. We saw what happened.
Yes.
At a time where we should be seeing intergovernmentalism, at a time where we should be seeing the height of multilateralism, the United States, for crying out loud, is pulling out of the United Nations, knowing fully well that it's the biggest funder of that body. What exactly drives all of this? It's the selfishness of countries. And at the end of the day, of course, the realist will tell you that it's about protecting national interest and national security. And so every country will act in certain ways.
But is that the right direction to go?
But that's the point I am making, that if this has opened our eyes to see that, look, well, the very country that was the foundation of multilateralism and collectivism is now moving towards the path of individualism and saying America first, shouldn't that be an eye-opener to other countries to say, all right, let's take up the mantle of looking inwards and finding a way, whether at regional level, sub-regional level, continental level, however you're going to go about it, and say, okay, the Chinese were able to do it. Other countries around the world have been able to do it. The Asian tigers were able to do it. Let's come back and look inwards and see how we can develop ourselves. Because the truth is this, I've had this conversation on different fronts, not just about economic relations, not just about political relations, even health-related issues. I've told medical doctor friends of mine, sickle cell, for example, is an African disease. No doctor in any big pharma, or forgive me, no doctor or any big pharmacist or anybody from Pfizer and these big corporations, you don't expect, you will not see them come to say, we're trying to find a cure to sickle cell. It's your problem. It will take inward, consciousness and innovation and scientific exploration, to be able to find a solution to these problems. The same applies to the Lake Chad Basin. It is our problem, right? As much as we will go to the United Nations, talk about these conversations, have these conversations, they also have their internal problems, they have their regional problems as well. So what we need to begin to do is show some level of commitment. Even if you're going to bring in foreign direct investment in whatever form, whether through multinational companies or even through bilateral relations, to say we're signing bilateral agreements with other countries to be able to recharge the Lake Chad Basin, we need to be in the forefront. Let's be in the, let's lead the vanguard of this campaign to say we're there, and then begin to show some level of commitment. Climate change is very, very linked to what we're talking about here. There are a lot of things around renewable energy, a lot of things that can be done with say, for example, what's been done in Sweden today. You see them use things like tree planting. You see them use things like, those sort of initiatives to be able to say, let's create buffer zones for these environments where perhaps we're having erosions and things like that.
We have a project like the global
the tree planting project. Yes, I know about that. But what I'm saying is, let's become more proactive. We're always reactive. It is always when it happens we react. Let's become more proactive. Let's be seen on top of it, right? And then perhaps we will begin to see all other countries, we talk about the powerful ones, come in and say, let's support and see how we can take this.
So just like you said, you want to set an agenda for the United Nations.
Yes.
So if I ask you, in what direction will you set an agenda for Mr. President?
Well,
ahead of his address in the
General whatever
Assembly
agenda we're going to be setting for Mr. President, it will have to coincide or be related or have a nexus with the theme of the conversation of the United Nations. But then again, of course, if I were to set an agenda for the president, the first area I would want the president to focus on is to be able to talk about the need for a deepened and sustained multilateral cooperation amongst nations within the international system. No country can live in isolation. What we saw in the era of COVID, what COVID brought to us, exposed the world to, should not be seen anymore. And then again, of course, the president needs to go with the discussion around, you see, the thing about foreign policy is it is intertwined with your domestic policy. The president needs to expose or appreciate some of the challenges that we're faced with around here, right? For example, if the president doesn't go out there to talk about how there's a need for functional literacy, how we should be able to, how the world should rally round that as aspect to get our young people employable, then there is absolutely no need for having a conversation, because it's about domestic and foreign relations, right? And then again, of course, there's the challenge of security, which has been internationalized. The president needs to go there with that conversation to tell the world that, look, there's a nexus between security and development. Without one, you cannot attain the other, right? And a lot of other issues, climate change, for example. We're taking climate change issues for granted, particularly in this part of the world. You talk about it, people go, it's too expensive or it's too... No, there are a lot of areas within the climate change field that we can key into, right? And bring our most prized assets, the women, into our economy and have a very sustained and robust growth within the economy.
Okay. Now, when the United Nations team in Nigeria visited Mr. President during the United Nations Day in Nigeria, Mr. President took a commitment that he will always be available. Yeah. Nigeria is always available. They should just make their request and Nigeria is available. And in return, United Nations resident coordinator talked about the fact that Nigeria has done so well, e.g. the completion of the United Nations House in Abuja after it was attacked by Boko Haram and other pluses. Yeah. Now, let's look at United Nations intervention in the northeastern part of Nigeria.
Okay.
How well, how far, and what should Mr. President be telling the United Nations in terms of reinforcing it to stem it totally down?
So the United Nations itself is a body that today is faced with the challenges of cash crunch. This is something that is biting hard on the entire globe. You look at the biggest funders of the United Nations today, they are the ones crying foul. The United States, for example, look at what's happening to its GDP. It's shrinking significantly, even way above ours. In the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks of coronavirus, people who filed for job loss in the United States were about 13 million and even over that. You know, so the United Nations itself is faced with a lot of these challenges. There's no doubt about that. What they have done in the northeastern part of Nigeria is that they have been able to set a pace for other multilateral agencies to come on board. This is not just the United Nations responsibility. Mind you, it's a United Nations. So the body itself has an enormous responsibility to deal with in terms of the challenges that every country face and its peculiarity. You look at countries in Eastern Europe, for example, they are also faced with the crisis of cash crunch. If every country is going to come to the UN and say, all right, we're dumping our problems on you, fix them, you know, the body is not going to survive. So what the UN has done in the northeastern part of Nigeria is that it has been able to say, all right, we're taking this amount of money, we're trying to see how we can rehabilitate, how we can reconstruct, how we can reintegrate people within this environment into society again and try to curtail some of their problems. What we should see is that the president should be able to talk to, using that platform, the multilateral agencies around the world that would aid and support the United Nations in bringing. That's why there are all kinds of side discussions at the United Nations. You use that opportunity to talk to these individual groups to be able to see how they can come in and support what is happening. Because without proper functioning in the northeastern part of Nigeria, the entire system, which is Nigeria, of course, has a problem to grapple with. And given that the Lake Chad Basin is situated within that region and the enormous resources that is deposited within that region, there's the need for a coordinated and sustained effort at seeing to, first and foremost, the de-radicalization of that area. Because often at times the conversation is always around demilitarization. No, beyond that, we need to look at the sociological issues, in-depth issues that have given birth to this monster called Boko Haram, which has sprung into the ISWAP African route now. You know, so you look at those sociological issues, you de-radicalize minds there. You understand what exactly the problems are that in the first place gives birth to these things. And there are basically twin issues: a widening gap in wealth distribution and so much income inequality. These are the reasons why we're faced with so much insecurity globally, not even necessarily within the Nigerian context.
We have had the 25th General Assembly, we have had the 50th, and we are now having the 75th, marking the 75th year of the United Nations. Yes. How significant is this?
It is very, very significant.
At a period where we had a global challenge, which is COVID-19.
Where I was going to go to. Okay. You know, that challenge was a litmus test for the United Nations. We're not in the era where people throw bombs and it's still going on, but not that conventional warfare type of, you know, confrontation. We don't see that basically playing out anymore significantly on the scale it used to when we had the League of Nations. You know, so the United Nations, yes, of course, has been able to fare well in terms of its primary mandate, which is about stopping the rise of a third world war, even though we're seeing certain indices that are pointers to the fact that there could be the eruption of a third world war. But that was the primary mandate for which that body was established. So yeah, it has done significantly well in terms of putting in place certain functional mechanisms. One of them will be the mutual assured destruction. There is the nuclear utilization target selection. And then, of course, the third, which is the growing interdependence among nation states, economic diplomacy. You know, so yes, the body has done fairly well in terms of this. But then there are contending challenges. Threats are changing. Okay. Right? So there's a need for the United Nations as a body to begin to understand contemporary threats that the globe faces. Today we're being faced no longer with conventional warfare. Today we're moving to hybrid and asymmetric warfare, kind of. And then, of course, there's also the challenge of poverty. Poverty is way above what it should be at a time and in a climb where wealth is so high. And then you have so much divide, and some people are extremely hungry and some are extremely wealthy. I mean, that gap should be breached. And the United Nations can do a lot in terms of galvanizing states and getting them to do the needful, to be able to bring about infrastructural developments, because these are the things you need for ordinary you and I to be able to thrive and survive.
Before we go, let's quickly touch on the World Trade Organization, because Nigeria has an interest.
Of course.
And as much as today that candidate is a West African candidate and also an African Union candidate, Nigeria has, let's talk to WTO.
Well, I see Nigeria making a headway. This is because of the persona of the candidate that is in the forefront in the race, right? So I think we're going to make that impact. Not to be, not to be seen as somebody who's trying to, make a forecast about future events. But I think she stands a very good chance of being, brought on board. But the question would be, after she gets there, what then for Nigeria? Remember, this is a woman we've seen in different spheres of leadership in different structures. Talk about the World Bank and so on and so forth. So the question again would be, which I have posed to herself and to Obi Ezekwesili, what impact have you made, or did you make, when you had this position, and what do we hope to see different when you return back to that position? Perhaps, given that you have been back to the national boundary, you have held position within Nigeria, maybe that should begin to influence whatever position or decisions they will begin to make at the WTO going further. But I don't know if things will be different, because in the past they really did not make any significant impact as far as things are concerned. And that's why when Obi was criticizing the concessionary loans coming from China with its long-term yield period and maturity rate, I was trying to attack her, like, what did you do when you were there, and things like that. I hope we'll begin to see something different from Madam Minister when she gets to WTO, well, because Dr. I do believe she's going to get there.
Dr. Muta Imam, time will not allow me to go into other areas as well. Maybe we'll do a part B on this.
I'm open to it.
Well, we hope too that being the 75th year of the United Nations and coming at a period where the world had a challenge, COVID-19,
yes,
a lot to be towards how do we do this if it happens again.
Of course, of course.
Okay, that's it on Diplomatic Ties today. We looked at issues ahead of the 75th General Assembly of the United Nations, and Mr. Nigeria President is due to address that assembly on the 22nd of September. My guest has set some agenda for him, recharging of the Lake Chad, the issue of global poverty eradication, which way forward. That's it on the program today. Thanks for watching.